Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to see you here tonight, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this superb institution. The National Constitution Center, as those of you who have been before know, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And tonight is a very special night because it marks the beginning of an effort to expand our mandate, our inspiring mandate around the world, and to begin to explore the connections between the U.S. constitutions and constitution making in the Middle East and in Europe and around the world. And this collaboration came about a few months ago when our very distinguished guest tonight, George Papandreou, the former Prime Minister of Greece, came to the National Constitution Center. And he said, "Can I see you?" And I said, "Of course, absolutely, it would be an honor." And he said, "I would like to create a collaboration between the two cradles of democracy, Athens and Philadelphia." But that's worth applauding. It was a brilliant idea, an inspiring idea to explore the connections between our two great ancient democracies. And of course, our American founders were so inspired by the Athenians, and also to explore the ways that American founders influence constitutional debates today. I won't steal any of the thunder, except we just started to talk about this great subject a moment ago, and it turns out that when the Greek government was debating the banking crisis, they compared the views of Jefferson and Hamilton. So really, we have so much to discuss tonight, and we hope that this panel will be the beginning of a collaboration between Prime Minister Papandreou's newly created Democracy Institute and the National Constitution Center that will include conferences and panels in both countries and will be an anchor of our foundation to explore the relevance of comparative constitution making. Let me introduce our panelists. I first want to acknowledge Timothy Miller, Prime Minister Papandreou's assistant, who's just done such a great job in organizing us and bringing us here today. I need to, of course, put in a plug for our town hall programs coming down the pike. It's been a thrilling couple weeks, and we've got a blockbuster week coming up. Tomorrow evening, we have a panel on the future of free speech with the nation's leading free speech thinkers, including Stanley Fish and Eric Posner and Jonathan Rauch. And no snow will deter what's bound to be a warming and illuminating discussion. And on Thursday, we're going to welcome back, after just a few weeks, Alan Dershowitz for a conversation about his nearly 50 years litigating some of the most famous cases of our time. And we also have coming down the pike Cass Sunstein, Senator Jim DeMint, Lynn Cheney, Justice Stevens. Please look at our wonderful spring mailer on the web and come to as many programs as possible. Now, please silence your cell phones. Know that our great staff will hand out note cards in the middle of the discussion so you can write down questions, which the panelists will take. And let me introduce our esteemed panel. All three of them are just the gold standard. Let me begin on my left with my dear colleague and old friend from George Washington University Law School, where I have long taught, David Fontana. He is an associate professor of law at GW. He is one of the leading comparative constitutionalists in the country. Really, he is more deft than anyone else in exploring the connections between global constitutions and explaining them to a general audience in many publications, including my own New Republic and on TV and on radio, and has become the leading translator of comparative constitutionalism of our time. He's consulted with Congress, presidential campaigns, and foreign drafters of constitutions. George Papandreou needs no introduction. He served as Prime Minister of Greece from October 2009 to November 2011. At the height of Greece's economic crisis, he was named one of Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers for making the best of Greece's worst year. And far more importantly, he has an inspiring story about constitution making to tell, because he helped consult with Europe in its constitutional drafting and brought great light and success to that situation. So thanks to the Prime Minister for having begun our collaboration and for being here. And finally, but by no means last, we have Amira Yahyaoui. She is a Tunisian peace activist, the founder of Balsala, which is an NGO that monitors the Constitutional Assembly and Parliament to protect the free expression of the Tunisian people and advocate for human rights, that understates the importance of her role in Tunisia, where she really was the leading advocate, watchdog of the Tunisian constitution making process and spent more time in the assembly as it drafted the constitution than anyone else, including the president. She has been an inspiring voice for civil liberties and constitutional values, and we're just thrilled to have her tonight. So please join me in welcoming David Fontana, Prime Minister George Papandreou, and Amira Yahyaoui.
Well, thank you everybody for coming for this wonderful event. Each time I come to this wonderful building and wonderful museum, I'm reminded not just of how important the Constitution was in American history and how important it still is in our political life, but something that we often forget, which is that the idea of writing down these important principles in a written document that we pledge to adhere by for dozens or hundreds of years going forward is something that influenced the rest of the world. We often think about 1789 as an event just within our borders, but the idea was something that permeated throughout the whole world. So I think part of what we'll try to talk about tonight is not just the American Constitution in its own context, but how it's inspired or kind of been considered by people in the rest of the world. And I think, as Jeff indicated, not just do we have very qualified panelists to talk about this, but I think these panelists represent some of the leading stories about constitutions in our time. I think the Arab Spring, as Amira will talk to us about, is kind of the leading future story about what's going to happen in constitutions in the world. Really one part of the world that has not had constitutions in the recent past that's now starting to consider them and experiment with them. And then Mr. Prime Minister, who says I can call him George. George will tell us about, maybe he'll call me Prime Minister then if I can't call him Prime Minister. Will tell us about, I think, a very recent success story. We think about Greece as not just the founder of democracy and not just a place where there's recent financial crises, but actually a place that very recently democratized and is kind of part of an entity, the European Union, with a lot of other countries that have had a successful recent experience. So I think we have a nice story to tell about the Constitution, not just several hundred years ago in the US, the focus of this museum, but in the more recent past and in the very near future. So what I'd like to first start off by talking about is just the Arab Spring specifically. So Amira, why don't you tell us about what happened in 2010 and 2011 in North Africa and the Middle East, and why it's so important to the rest of the world, not just to that region.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation. What happened is just a normal way to become a human being, actually. People of the Arab country just asked for this natural thing, which is democracy and freedom and rights. So many countries went through the process, first Tunisia, then Egypt, then Yemen. And I truly believe that during these 50 years, all the Arab countries will go through a revolution, because you can see people living in free worlds and yourself just shut up under a dictatorship. So it's just normal to go through these revolutions. So in Tunisia, we had a first constitution in 1959, which was considered as the most progressive Arab constitution. And it was really a challenge for Tunisians to write another progressive constitution, knowing that that constitution of 1959 was considered in 2011 a progressive constitution for the other countries. So the question was, in the beginning, now we took off this dictator, what we will be. So the idea of voting for this parliament was to answer this question: what is our common dream, actually? What do we want to see our country going through? But since Tunisia was under dictatorship for all its history, finally we found ourselves answering another question, which was who we are. And that was a very difficult exercise, knowing that the Tunisian Assembly decided to go from a blank page and not to take a model. But really, I mean, without being really aware of what they were doing. Actually, all the MPs were reading constitution all over the world, the American, the Europeans ones, etc. And they were taking them as example. And that was very interesting to see. So what are we doing? I mean, Tunisia, and I'm talking about more about the Arab region. We are answering a very simple question, which is democracy and human rights a universal concept? Because until 2011, the answer was no. No, not because the idea is not, these concepts are universal, but the answer was no because all the people around the world, all the religions around the world didn't believe on the universality of human rights. And this is what happened in 2013. That, I mean, Tunisia, when Tunisia voted for this constitution, and we will talk about the core and the articles that we can find in this constitution. Actually, we said to the world that a poor Muslim, small country, Arab, is and want a democracy and wrote a democracy in its constitution. And so by that, we answered the question, and it was a yes, yes. Democracy is a universal concept. Human rights are universal. Yeah.
So George, Amira is telling us this very inspiring story about a part of the world that's really trying to define itself, breaking off the shackles of dictatorship, trying to define itself as a democracy. What role can the international community play, particularly the US and the EU?
Well, first of all, I think what Amira said is very important, because in Europe we had a similar debate. Europe is, think of the United States as 50 states. Well, we are now 28 states, but with different cultures, different religions, different ethnic backgrounds. But as Europe is growing, we are thinking of incorporating countries which are, for example, predominantly Muslim, such as Turkey. Mm-hmm. Greece is a neighbor to Turkey, and at some point when I was foreign minister, I had to make a decision: should we help Turkey become a member or not? And there was a large number of Europeans that were saying, you can't bring in Turkey, it's a Muslim country, we are Christian, and democracy is basically a Western concept, a Christian concept, and so on. I said no. I said, first of all, coming from ancient Greece, I said, well, we had 12 gods. We didn't have one god. So maybe that's why we became pretty democratic too, because we had gods fighting amongst themselves. But but secondly, I said, as Amira says, whatever religion you have, that doesn't mean there aren't some very fundamental values and rights that are there that we need to protect. And this is where the Constitution is very important, because that's what basically the Constitution is saying. The Constitution is you can have different parties, you can have different views, but the Constitution is a unifying framework of values, which we say, this is what our common identity is. This is what we share. This is what is our not only our common heritage, but our future is going to be too. And this is what unites us, no matter how diverse we are. So I think when we in Europe, as Jeff was saying earlier, Greece was under dictatorship. I lived under dictatorship. I know what the transition to a democratic country was, and it's difficult. But half of the population of the European Union today were recently under dictatorships. Half of the population. We don't realize that, but if you think of the southern countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, were dictatorships. Central and Eastern Europe were, of course, in the Soviet bloc, dictatorships. So Europe has had the process of institution building, constitution building is part of what we are doing. When we talk about enlarging Europe, basically we're talking about bringing in countries and societies into this family of common values by establishing them: human rights, freedom of speech, open societies, open markets, social cohesion, minority rights, gender rights, and so on, non-discrimination. These are basic issues which have become central. I think what we can do from the US and the EU point of view, if we're talking about the Arab world, the EU is of course a neighbor to to the Arab world, but the U.S. has a major role also. First of all, I think we have to realize this is an ownership that they have to have. I mean, this is something that and I think that was the highlight of it shattered this myth that the Muslim world can't be democratic, because this was not an imposed change. It wasn't an intervention, a military intervention that unluckily has happened in times. When we get into the politics of the Iraq War, for example, this came from below. This came from society. It came from grassroots. It came from the demand of the citizens. We want to change our own countries. So this was not something that came out of an imposition, but it was an inspiration from the bottom. What we need to do is help them in their path. We have the experience. I mean, when I first met with Amira and in the meetings we had with a number of other Arab Spring young leaders, I said, I don't want to impose anything on you. I want what you should take from our experience. We've learned from the good and the bad of how we transitioned our constitutions. See what is good for you, and we can help you. I remember, for example, when Greece became democratic after the mid-70s, basically, of course we had a constitution. That's one thing, so the content is important, but the process was also important, how much people actually got involved. We had a referendum, and that was very important. It was 75% or 70% accepted some of the major changes. And thirdly, the implementation and understanding what this means in daily practice. So I got involved in civic education. And I went around all of Greece trying to teach. I had lived outside of Greece. What does it mean to be in a democracy? Think of yourself being in jail for, let's say, 20 or 30 years, and all of a sudden you're left out into the street and you're free. But you're blinded by the light. You don't know where to walk. Your legs are weak. You're not really sure what this world is about. But you want to really use that potential and that freedom. So this is where we need solidarity and give the experience and show the tools that you do have the power to make decisions and so on. And people would very often, I remember in the villages in Greece, would say, well, you have to decide, or somebody else is going to decide. And so even though they wanted a democracy, they wanted the freedom, they hadn't realized that they have a power to actually make decisions. And I think that was important to get that message across. So I think we do have a lot to give them as far as our experience, our knowledge, but then make sure that this in the end is owned by their own processes.
So it reminds me of, in some of my travels to the region, what surprised me the most wasn't that the idea of a constitution was rejected by leaders or citizens there, was that they weren't even necessarily aware of what a constitution was. So when I went to Libya just this past September, I assumed, why have somebody like me come in and talk? Why not have the Libyan professors of constitutional law? And then someone told me, of course, this is not a class that you offer at the university when you don't have a constitution. So a lot of times just starting to talk about these things can be a really important first step. Now, Amira, you've been working on kind of the Tunisian constitution, but also in its global and regional context, looking at how what Tunisia is talking about compares to what other countries have done or are considering doing. How would you say that Tunisia or Arab Spring countries think about constitutions in similar or different ways than the U.S. does, and that the U.S. Constitution does in its text?
I mean, first of all, the Tunisian constitution has 149 articles. That's a huge difference already. It's different because, I mean, the U.S. constitution is about a macro way of seeing things, as you said in the room. And we had more of a European constitution, which means 100 articles or more. So we went through real details, but it was important to go through real details because we needed to be sure that everyone agreed, for example, on freedom of expression, on gender equality, on, I don't know, independence of justice, etc. Some of these details, you don't have them in the US Constitution. And it was very healthy to have the discussion, to fight for it, and to go through vote to decide that this is what it is now. Talking about the region, and it's, I mean, why? I mean, so for those who are not very familiar with the Arab Spring, only Tunisia passed a democratic constitution. And only Tunisia went through a very long process of 2 years and a half. And only Tunisia went through a democratic process, which was discussing every article, vote for it, go to committees, talk to people, work with civil society, work with international academics, Q, for example, etc. And what happens now, I mean, I worked on every article of that constitution. I know why every comma is there and why it's, why we put, I mean, a comma. I will talk about it later on. Gender equality, it was very important about the comma. And so, and I know how every person MPs met and how every article changed through these 2 years and a half. And what I know the most was when we were searching for how can we, for example, write an article about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. We took lots of constitution. I think the work of the assembly was based on 30 constitutions around the world. And the problem I had each time I answered, how is it outside of Tunisia, it was, so this is how it's written by European countries. This is how it's written by American countries. This is how it's written in Asian countries. But I never had the chance to say this is how other Arab countries did. And so now with this new constitution, what is very interesting, and I will work a lot on the Libyan process, is that Libyans will not say, and it will be easier for them, when they will say we will not limit freedom of speech, for example, to sacred or whatever, they will not say this is how it's written by the US or France or Greece. They would say this is how it's written by another country, which is the same as ours, with the same identity, same religion, same problems. I mean, and that's very important. I mean, when you write a constitution, the first thing you do is to see how is it elsewhere, and I mean, it's important now. So now Libya will go through this process. We're still waiting for the results for now a month. Yeah, and the new Egyptian constitution will never. I mean, they will have to change it. I think Egypt will pass by another revolution, or I would say Egyptian will continue their revolution until the end because they didn't finish it. Now it's clear dictatorship, and they will have to pass through this transitional period. But not only these countries. I mean, no one talks about Algeria, which is a dictatorship, and Bouteflika is running for the 4th mandate. No one talks about the Moroccan constitution, which is from the outside very democratic, but actually you can say a word about the king. And no one talks about the Jordanian, etc. And of course, no one even thinks about the Saudi constitution, for example, where women don't even have the right to drive. So this is why I'm saying, I mean, these 50 years, all these countries will change because democracy, I mean, is no longer, I mean, with blue eyes and yellow, I mean, blonde hair. So now democracy looks like an Arab, which is very important. And this is why it's not, I mean, what we see in the news or what we see in international TV channels. It's what we see next to us, like in Tunisia. And this is why I think many countries will go through this process.
So George, Amira's talked a little bit about how constitutions are thought about in kind of Arab countries compared to the US. From your experience, how would you compare how constitutions are thought about in Europe to the United States? Jeff talked about Athens and Philadelphia as the cradles of democracy, but there's still some differences in how they think about democracy and constitutions. What sorts of differences are there?
I think one thing which I want to pick up from Amira before we get into the constitution, the comparison is that we see our democracies as mature democracies. However, if you actually ask people in our societies, in our mature democracies, they have complaints about our democracies too, about whether they are working well, whether they are responding to the needs of the people. And so I think, even though they are nascent democracies, their attempts are lessons, either to be avoided, but also to learn. What Amira was saying about how they developed the constitution, I think is a lesson for many politicians around the world. South Africa did this also, and I think South Africa and Tunisia have some similarities in the process of how they developed the constitution. It was a consensual process. It was an attempt to bring in participation, to bring in voices, diverse voices, to make sure that once you reached a text, it could actually be, the average person in the street could identify with that and feel that they owned this constitution as theirs. That's very different than what we may have seen in Egypt, or what you see when somebody imposes a constitution. You have a 97% vote for a constitution, but you realize that this is a dictator that basically has passed a constitution, which is the people just have voted out of fear or out of fraud. It's been 97%. So this participatory process is what I think we need to think back again to. That harks back to the ancient Greek type of a democracy, where we have more of a direct democracy, more of a participative democracy, where to be a citizen was a duty, a responsibility, an honor, and people actually served, on average, twice in their lifetime in public office. If you were not a participant, you were considered a private person, and a private person in Greek is the word idiotis, which has come down to the English as the word idiot. So a person, it was, if you were not a citizen, you were not participating, there must be something wrong with you. But that, I think, she also says we need to bring back this participation. Now, there was a debate, from what I understand. Full disclosure, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal expert. I'm a sociologist in background, but I bring more from my experience. And what I've read is that there was a debate even in the United States about what kind of a constitution will this be. Will it be more like the ancient Athenian constitution or democracy, more like the Roman democracy? There was even a debate about whether the official language of the U.S. was going to be Greek or English, and I think it lost by 3 votes. So you might have been speaking Greek. So. But I think the more Roman centralized, even though there was a very strong feeling of disrupting power, didn't want and this is what democracy is, was sort of won out is through this representative democracy rather than more than direct democracy. But democracy itself, from the ancient concept, wasn't a political innovation. What it was a realization that politics, the Greeks realized at some point that politics, what was it? It was, you had tyrants, you had high priests, you had kings, you had emperors or whatever in the ancient times. Your fate was sealed. As citizens, you didn't even know you're not a citizen. You were a slave. You were an orderly. You were simply to be ordered. Now, at some point, the Greeks realized in their city-states that, no, we don't have to take orders from anybody. We can actually make our own fate. We can change things. That's what politics was and what it should be, to imagine a different world and collectively make it happen. And democracy was there. Why? Democracy there to disrupt the concentration of power so that you wouldn't have tyrants taking it back. You wouldn't have some dogma or something. And it was also an idea of using the potential of people. So I think we need to rethink our societies, both in Europe and in our mature societies, and see how we use the new tools, whether it's the internet, whether it's the Facebooks, whether it's the local government, how we bring back some of the spirit of participation.
Now, Amira, if you read the American newspapers about the Arab Spring, you'll read a lot about Egypt and how the Arab Spring is not turning out so well over 3 years later. There's not a lot of coverage of Tunisia little more coverage about Libya. In fact, one of the first time I went to Tunisia, and I called the credit card company to tell them I was going to Tunisia, not to block the charges. And the very kind person on the other end asked me, is Tunisia near Oregon? So it was an easy question to answer. The answer is no, it's not near Oregon. But Tunisia and Libya, and also Yemen, which you mentioned initially, don't receive as much attention. So I guess, what can we learn from what's going on in the Arab Spring countries outside of Egypt? What's going well in Tunisia? What's not going as well in Libya? And Yemen maybe somewhere in the middle.
When I say I'm from Tunisia, people ask me if I'm from Indonesia, so I know what it is. Yes, you don't read much about Tunisia because we're a French-speaking country, and I mean, you have very few people who speak English, so we don't PR in English. And you will read more about it in Europe than in the United States, knowing that we are very lucky. We are a very lucky country because we don't have gas, we don't have anything. We don't have Israel or anyone on our borders, and we're very small. So, and this is why I think we're succeeding. The Arab countries. There are, I mean, when you are Tunisian or from the Maghreb countries, so Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, you see yourself very different from the Gulf countries. And we have a huge ignorance about what's happening there. We are completely turned, and we are only interested in Europe as Maghreb countries and the Mediterranean specifically. And so with this constitution, we learn more about the other Gulf countries. So it's a huge mess, we can say it, about rights, constitutions, etc. The only country where it's interesting to go and to see what is happening is Kuwait, where women are free and where is a real sense of participation, discussion. It's not a democracy, but it looks like. The other one, it's like Morocco, more or less. But now, so things are very hot in Algeria. People are out in the streets against Bouteflika's re-elections. Libya voted for its constitutional assembly, but as I said, we are still waiting for the names now for a month. It's very different. I mean, Tunisia and Libya, even if we share borders, are very different because we have institutions. They don't. And that's I mean, a big challenge for them to think about processes when they are not used to processes. To think about participation where there is no institution and organization to have participation, where there is a huge fight on gas and oil there, and constitution democracy now is, I mean, it's not the first interest of Libyan people. Egypt is clear, I mean, a dictatorship, and as we were discussing, it's even worse than under Mubarak. But it doesn't mean anything. Everyone knows that these countries, when they start their revolution, they will be able to talk about real democracy in 10 years. So the process is very long. I am myself surprised by how fast we went in Tunisia, but it's normal that it takes this time. What we try to do is to share the experience, is to show hope. What I mean by hope is to say I was very active during the revolution and against Ben Ali, the former president, the dictator. And when we started, talking about doing a revolution in Tunisia, we weren't thinking only about our country. I was in, every day in contact with people in Libya, in Algeria, in Egypt, in all these countries, because we know each other from internet. And so we did it, go ahead and do it. And today I was reading my tweets of 2010, and I was reading, I do 10 tweets about Tunisia, 1 tweet about Egypt. So we were completely focusing on taking out our dictator, but at the same time, we think we think about the region, and this is very important. I mean, the Arab region is more than 400,000 people who speak the same language and with the same religion. So it's huge for us. And this is why, even though the dictators kept the borders very clear, I mean, I need a visa to go to Egypt. I need a visa to go to Jordan. I need a visa to go to, Morocco. While you don't, as European, you don't need a visa to go to Egypt, and you don't need a visa to go to Morocco, and you as American, you don't need them. So they, I don't know how to say it in English, but there is
divide
this,
and rule.
Yeah, divide. That's it.
Yeah.
And so now what is happening is, I mean, with internet, there is no longer any borders. So we can talk freely, and it has a huge impact on the global situation, the regional situation, because everyone can see what is happening outside. And as you saw, Erdogan cut Twitter off, and it was so funny because the stats show that there are more people on Twitter now than when Twitter was open in Turkey. So and people are using more Twitter in Turkey now rather than before. And what is very funny is that people who are pro Erdogan, they use Twitter more to talk about Erdogan now than before. So the point is, now it's open. We see each other's, and we all want to look like the best one of us. And this is why everyone is pushing to go to this, what we call the new Tunisian model. But the interesting part is, we as Tunisian, when we were discussing Sharia, we were discussing gender inequality, limitation of freedom of speech, etc., many MPs were saying, I mean, you are crazy asking for the non-limitation of freedom of speech to sacred. You mean you can, like, just publish cartoons about God? And I was, yes, I just see the point. And they say, see, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, you can go to jail for forever because of that. Says, yes, but in Sweden, it's not the case. And so in Tunisia, we refused to see those who are worse than us. And we were really thinking universally, which means we were considering ourselves from the world. And so every country in the world can be a model for us. And then we're not stuck in this region and we have to see this dictatorship and say, oh God, how lucky we are, because I can at least now mock the president. So it's very interesting, but at the same time...
So you can leapfrog to even go further ahead than you would expect by making gains that you wouldn't otherwise have done if you didn't have all these other models.
Absolutely.
You could go beyond what...
Absolutely. Yes, and we were even, we were so not humble because we were even criticizing some democratic old countries saying, you don't have this article in your constitution. For example, now we have in our constitution 140 articles, so we can put whatever on it. We have this article talking about access to information and to internet, which is a right to have access to internet. And this is, you can only, even Iceland don't have it. So, it's funny, we have like access to water. Many new way, it's a 21st century constitution.
It reminds me, Vladimir Putin says that the U.S. is not a democracy because of Bush v. Gore. This is one of his famous comments that he likes to repeat. Any country that picks its president by the Supreme Court can't really be democracy. One interesting, I think, theme that Amira's comments brought up too is we tend to think in a museum like this, in a country like this, that constitutions only come from revolutions, that it's only a dramatic moment with people in the streets that creates a constitution. Most constitutions of the world are created in existing regimes with governments that already work. And having a constitution that comes after a revolution can be particularly hard. Creating democracies, creating constitutions that works are more like a marathon than a sprint. And after a revolution, people have very high expectations very quickly. They want things resolved very quickly. That's why they took the risk of protesting in the streets. And then when I was in Tunisia the first time, the more people were talking to me about the increase in the unemployment rate than they were about the revolution. I think it went from 12 to 18% or something. And before coming here today, I did look up in the New York Times and Washington Post in 2012, there were more stories about Tunisia's economy being hurt because of the decrease in American and European tourism than there were about constitutions and everything. So it can create a lot of chaos when constitutions come out of revolutions. Which leads me to George. We've talked a little bit about kind of constitutions and democracy going forward, but the last significant moments of lots of countries trying to create constitutions and democracy were really in Europe after the wall fell in '89, before in Greece and Spain and Portugal in the 70s and 80s. Are there lessons that Amira's part of the world, that the Arab Spring countries might take from what worked in Europe in the past several decades?
I think there's some important lessons. I agree. And first of all, one thing that Amira said, which I think is very interesting, if you think of Europe as so many different countries, we could take the best practices too. So we could start looking and say, okay, we like what they do in Sweden on that issue. We like what they do in France on that issue. We like what they do in Germany on that issue. So in fact, if you have a leadership that's ready to innovate and to think more openly and progressively about what your country could be in the future, you can actually pick and choose what the best things are. And I think this is what Europe has as somewhat of a comparative advantage. And not only Europe, of course, it's the world itself. So it could be the US. We're talking a lot about the US and Europe for another reason, because we are not a federation, but we're thinking of slowly becoming some form of a confederation and seeing how did US do it? What were the basic elements of this? Secondly, what Europe did also was it became a magnet of saying you can become part of our society or our family under certain conditions. Let us assume, for example, that Mexico or Costa Rica or Panama or I don't know, some other Central American country was going to become a member of the United States, a 51st or 52nd state. What would the demands be from your side? What kind of changes would they have to make in their country? So what happened was that all of a sudden, these countries that were going to access to become part of the European Union, the club called the European Union, we were then had to follow certain rules, and particularly the countries of Central and Eastern Europe had to follow certain rules of, okay, you have to have human rights, you have to have open market, you have to have basic rule of law, justice system, a number of things, and of course the Constitution with specific values. So that became a motivating force. Now, can that be expanded to a wider neighborhood from, let's say, the Arab Mediterranean world all the way up to Ukraine, for example, which is an issue right now? And what we have is that we are creating association agreements with countries like Tunisia and with Egypt and with, which is partly aid, but it's also access to the markets. So it's slowly integrating these countries into a wider socio-economic situation. And what we, therefore, in doing that, we are saying, in order to be part of this wider family, there's, again, certain norms. So if you are violating human rights, we won't allow you to access all these markets. So we won't allow you to have all these contacts with us and so on. So we are creating a motivation to help these countries. And I think this is where Europe The last few years has lost out because we were very introverted in dealing with the financial crisis, when history was being made around us, when we actually should have been much more active in providing new options. One option, for example, would be that there's a lot of sun in the southern Mediterranean, and they could provide northern Europe with green energy, with solar energy. So these are types of projects which could actually be developed. We could provide them with more technical know-how as far as how you develop constitutions and so on. And the U.S. also in this center, obviously, is a natural one for that. And I think that these are the types of things which Europe can and the U.S. can provide and help for this region in helping them develop into vibrant democracies.
So I want to turn to some of the wonderful questions I received from the audience. First, let me ask you, Amira, a few of the questions ask about what role civil society can play in creating a culture of constitutionalism and creating a successful constitution. So I guess to interpret these questions, how can we have more people like you, more people who are effective in these countries in creating a dialogue about constitutions and then creating a document that actually works?
I think in Tunisia, the biggest part of the work has been done by civil society. We had a real representative parliament. What I mean by real representative parliament, I mean we have fruit seller, we have people, jobless people as MPs. We had, I mean, every kind of people in Tunisia, and most of them are very poor, not really educated, and certainly not with a law degree. And so that was very good in a part because we were sure that this constitution will be the constitution of everyone. This is why even if we didn't have referendum on this constitution, people feel they represent them, because when they see the people sitting in that assembly, they look like them. It's not the elite writing something for the people. And so the role of civil society was to help them write it down, to understand the technical parts, to understand why you can put, for example, rights to fruit in the Constitution. Why can't you put right to work, for example? That was a huge discussion. They wanted to put the right to work, to have a job. And so how can you put the right to have a job? I mean, what should the government do with that? You don't have, you are jobless, you go to the government and says, the Constitution says you need to give me a job. It can't work. And knowing that this Constitution came after a social, uprising, I mean, we had this kind of socio-economic article that everyone wanted to put, and without any logic. And so civil society helped it with this. Second thing is our MPs thought that they were, we elected them to write a constitution by themselves. And they don't owe people anything because we already elected them. So no accountability, and the accountability for them was, if you don't like me, don't vote for me next time. But meanwhile, you have no right to tell me that this is wrong and this is right. And we had a huge, my NGO had big fights with some MPs in the beginning because of this. Because we were, no, you can't just close the committee and stay by your own and write whatever you want. We voted for you. You are here to write something that we understand and we want. And so civil society made these MPs who had no experience of politics, law, nothing. Most of them, they didn't even travel it once in their life. I mean, they don't know the word. Most of them, they only speak one language, which was Arabic. And as I said, there were no Arabic good constitution at that time. And so we helped them translating things. Why rights are not against the religion, why rights can work with Islam, why women can exist with, why if you give equality to women, it's not against Islam. And so this was the work of civil society. But I wanted to answer the question you asked.
And I hope you'll tell us about the comma, the importance of the
I
comma,
will
which you
talk
mentioned
about the
earlier.
comma. But about what you asked George for, the revolution, how difficult it is to go through a revolution, and it makes countries very weak, like Tunisia now. I love this story. So it's a funny story that Slavomir Mrozek wrote. He is a Polish writer, and he wrote this text called Revolution. And he said, I went to my house one day and I dreamt of revolution and I decided to be a revolutionary. So I took my bed and I changed the place of my bed. I changed the place where my seat was and changed the place where my desk was. And 2 weeks after, I get used to that. So I changed them again. I kept changing them. And then I decided to put my chair under my desk, etc., etc. But I get used to it. So it wasn't really revolutionary. So I decided to, I'm making it very short, I decided to sleep on my desk. And I had really a headache, and it was really not comfortable. And really, I tried many days, and I didn't get used to it. So after a month, I was fed up with this situation, and I decided to stop being a revolutionary. So I put my bed where it was, my desk where it was, and my chair in his place, and slept on my bed, and it was so good. So every time I think about revolution, I think about the day I was a revolutionary. And it's true. I mean, when you decide to be a revolutionary and then you see how your country suffer from it, it's a tough decision. And now in Tunisia, because this is something that we always forget, because we always talk about law when we talk about constitution, is how economic is important for a constitution, how economy is important for a constitution. So for example, I mean, I'm traveling the world, meeting leaders all over, and they are always asking me with this very sweet way of asking someone coming from the Arab Spring, how can we help you? I say, listen, we got democracy and rights. Don't worry, now we understood it. So if you can just invest in my country and create jobs, that would help us a lot. Because as we saw it all over the world, and we're not different, as I said in the beginning, in the good parts and the bad parts, is that when you are poor, and you are suffering from economy, you always vote and you become very extremist in your way of thinking. You try to close everything. And this is something which is very important now for us in Tunisia. I mean, these 5 years coming, we will be implementing laws, not constitution, but regular laws. And we have lots of regular laws to change, because now they are not, I mean, they are against the constitution. But at the same time, when, for example, we write something about the right to equal payment for men and women, and you are in a huge economic crisis, then I'm not sure that we will, when we put gender equality on everything, and then we have to change this regular law, when you are in a very bad economy, I'm not sure that law will pass. So this is why, I mean, it goes together. If we push on this without, I mean, if we push on economy without pushing on rights, it don't work. But it goes also the other way around.
One thing that all of this discussion about revolution reminds me of too is one word that's becoming very popular in modern times is revolution, but another word that's becoming less popular is patience. Yeah. And revolutions require patience, but with Twitter, with the internet, with information being so readily available, it's hard to wait. But we forget that our Constitution here was very much in danger even in the early 19th century. A few miles from where I live in Washington, in 1801, well over a decade after our Constitution started, there were riots outside of the Capitol as the House of Representatives was meeting to pick the president. So revolutions require patience, and it's hard when you know what's going on in the rest of the world to be patient. But revolutions really require some time to consolidate and to work well. So, George, we also have some questions about Ukraine. So let me ask you to put on your foreign minister and prime minister hat, and I guess kind of think about Ukraine, what it means for a country going through a revolution, and then I guess kind of geopolitically, the world's response to Ukraine and what that might tell us about what the world's response might be or should be in Arab Spring countries.
It's a good question, a difficult one. Let's look at what I think the situation is quite complicated, and you can find debates, you can find arguments on both sides that have some legitimacy. So Russia is saying we want to protect the Russian population in Crimea, and the only way we can do it is by annexing or separating Crimea from Ukraine. Well, the whole concept of Europe is predicated on something completely different. We in Europe have fought over borders, first of all, First World War, Second World War, massacres, holocausts, and so on, annexations. But this has been the history of Europe for more than 1,000 years, where you would say, okay, there's a population there, a Germanic population that we want to protect because that's in another country, in a French country or another place, let's unite with them. But we are a very diverse continent. We may have enclaves of groups, minorities, but we're very diverse. And what we ended up in Europe saying is saying, listen, we cannot protect people by changing borders. Whether you're on one side of the border or another side of the border, whether you're a Hungarian in Romania, whether you're an Albanian in Montenegro, whether you are a Greek in Albania, whether you are a Muslim in Bulgaria or Greece or a Greek in Turkey, we're not going to change the borders to solve the problems of minorities. If you, let's say, said that we have Hungarians in Romania and you want to protect Hungarians by changing borders, they would have to cut off part of Romania, and then all of a sudden you would be protecting the Hungarians, but the Romanians in that area would become the new minority, and you would have a fight. And that's what we had in the Balkans for years and years and years. That's what we had recently with Yugoslavia falling apart, where people said we want ethnically clean Serbia or an ethnically clean Croatia or an ethnically clean Bosnia or whatever. You can't have ethnically clean or sort of monocultures anymore in the world, and particularly in this global world. So this is where constitutions come in, where you say there are basic human rights which have to be respected irrespective of what side of the border you're on and what country you live in. And that's the challenge, but also the beauty of what a constitution and the rule of law can give. Had the Russians in Ukraine felt that there was a government and a constitution that protected their rights in a way where they didn't have to say, we have to leave, why would they want to leave? If they felt they had a future in that country, and this, of course, was somewhat of a failure of the elite of after the breakaway from the then Soviet Union, of not being able to create a constitution, democratic structures, implement the laws, as Tunisia is doing now, in a way which would integrate all these different parts of Ukraine. I remember when I was foreign minister on Cyprus, we have it's a united island, but there was an invasion in 1974 by Turkey to protect, as they said, the Turkish community on Cyprus, the Turkish Cypriot community. So they were saying, we are going to bring in our military to protect this, basically a minority or a smaller community compared to the Greek Cypriot community. When I was foreign minister, I said, well, Cyprus is now going to become part of the European Union. So in the European Union, where we have a European, basically, constitution of basic rights, your rights, whether you're Turkish Cypriot or Greek Cypriot, will be guaranteed. So you don't need a military. You don't need to be annexed, or you don't need to have the protection of some father or motherland or whatever. You will be protected by the rule of law. You will be protected by a basic European constitution. And they voted 60% for the unification. Now, the Greek side did not. That's for another reason. I won't get into that right now. But they voted to actually be reunited in Cyprus. So what I'm saying is that constitutions are very important in the sense of not only at the national level, but as these principles have to start becoming more universal, as Amir was saying in the beginning, that there's a universality to these values. And I think in our global context, in our global world, if we want to govern this world, if we want to govern deal with climate change, financial problems, migration, refugees, conflicts, we slowly have to build a framework of values where we can say, guys, these are universal. Citizens of the world, these are universal principles. Is there a universal global citizen, in a sense? And so I think all these revolutions and all these changes, as Amira said, they're not simply looking inside to your country, which is sort of the day-to-day life, but it's also looking where are we how are we linking up in this world, in this global world, where we're twittering with each other, we're on Facebooks, we're communicating, we're living with each other, we're interconnected. We will be facing this need for more global values. So I think Ukraine, I won't get into details of how we could solve it, that's another question. But if we could bring to bear and in the discussions with Russia, and Europe could play a more constructive role in this, and of course the US too, that, listen, let's look and see how we protect the citizens there, and not how we change borders. That would be in the best of all of our interests.
One thing this reminds me of too is taking constitutions seriously as nonpartisan documents, as Jeff talks about them, and as this center stands for, also means people outside those countries taking the Constitution seriously. So one interesting thing in the State Department and the Justice Department in Washington, and this is true under Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, when something like what happens in Ukraine happened, there are lawyers who look through documents like the Constitution of Ukraine to see whether it was constitutional to do what Putin did, to actually go through the language, get an English language translation, and have the lawyers go through and see whether or not it was consistent with the Constitution. So often taking a constitution seriously is about leaders within a country, but also leaders outside of the country. So as we're running short on time, I want to think about the future. So Amira, 5 years from now, let's say we're back here. There's a picture of Jeff and George up here for successfully creating the Athens-Philadelphia dialogue.
And the Arab Spring being the catalyst.
Where do you think things will be in 5 years? In Tunisia, but really more the region generally. Do you think in 5 years we'll come back here to celebrate a success, more in a failure, or somewhere in between?
It depends on the country. What a question. First, the question is, how can we measure success? What is success in these countries? If I take my country, I think I can measure success first by, will we have elections? Will these elections be free and fair, transparent, democratic elections? And then, during these 5 years, what have we done with all these laws that are against the Constitution? And how did we respect the Constitution? Tunisia is not only a very good story, no. We had very bad moments. For example, when we were, the MPs were discussing freedom of conscience, rights, freedom of conscience, and freedom of expression. We were jailing. We put in jail Jaber, who was a cartoonist who shared cartoons about God and the Prophet for 7 years. He has been jailed for 7 years. And that was, complete schizophrenia. We were, come on, you're just writing it right now and you're telling it in the outside. And so when the Constitution has been voted, he has been freed. So he went out from jail. And I think we will have other tests like this. For example, when we say freedom of press, and maybe, I don't know, in 1 year we will censor in a press, I don't know, a news paper, or I don't know, then we will have this test. Will we use the Constitution, or because we think this is not right, we will accept it? And so the challenge for us is, will we respect this Constitution? And as you said, it's very important that politicians and the people in power believe on it and respect it themselves, because they can just ignore it and do whatever. They would say they voted for us. But for the rest of the countries, Libya is a huge challenge, I think. And I think, everyone should focus on that, because it will be very, very hard, because they are really starting from nothing, from zero. And I remember when I talked with an NGO in Egypt, people in Egypt who wanted to duplicate my NGO. So I was explaining to them that in Tunisia, in our constitution, MPs, we don't have access to the voting record. And what my NGO do is we film the voting process, and then we match who was green, and so that MP was sitting there, the light was green, so he voted yes and no. And we did this with all articles. And so the Libyan person I talked to said, oh, I don't think that they will hide this because they don't want transparency. I think they will hide it because if some MPs vote against what the streets want, they will kill them. Okay, we're not talking about the same thing. And so he said, I think transparency is very important, and he studied at Oxford, etc. But I'm not sure with this. I think we should not release the voting record. Let them reach consensus. And so, this is from where they are starting, and this is why I'm saying every eye should be on that process. Egypt, in 5 years, I'm not very optimistic. I think Egypt in 5 years will maybe, hopefully, be in the transitional process, not finish their transition. Syria is a civil war. And, we're seeing it. They are, now I think they are for 10 years at least in civil war. But the interesting part is these countries that we never talk about, which are Algeria, Morocco, but also these countries like, some Gulf countries, like, Yemen, etc. But I'm talking about the Arab region, but it's not only about the Arab region. It's about I would say it's about the Muslim region, which includes Iran. And what will Iran do now that they are opening discussions with the US, that they will have elections with their new not president, and Turkey stepping back to a dictatorship. So Turkey, what's happening today is going to, they are returning back to square zero. And so what will happen in Turkey when you see people already used to democracy and politicians, they are not? And so it's a very interesting test, because it will maybe be also the future of Europe if this economic crisis goes bigger and bigger, people are already used to democracy. I mean, if, for example, in Egypt, Sisi decides to cut off Twitter, people will not try to mock him on Twitter because they know he can come, he can send police and put them in jail. While in Turkey, it's not the same case. People are making it like it's a joke. And because they are too used to democracy now, and so he is like living in his own world. He's not aware of what is happening in the streets. And in Tunisia now, for example, this is also very interesting because we feel like the Turkish people. Now, no one can come to a Tunisian and say, you don't have the right to say this. You don't have the right to criticize the government. I mean, we are all the time criticizing it. This is the first sport in Tunisia. So it depends on the country, but it depends also on the role of the countries who hopefully go through success, like Tunisia. Will Tunisia be, I mean, a real model like Turkey was? And Turkey was a model for us too. Will Tunisia think about the rest of the world? Will Tunisia become more present in the international decisions? Will Europe and America and all these big democracies of the G8, etc., will they think about helping a country that is succeeding or is too small? So it also depends on this. This is the first, this is the laboratory of democracy in the Arab world, which is giving good results, let's say. And will we invest on these results? Will we think that actually we need a model that even if we, I think if I was Obama, I would love to see Egypt going through democracy. I mean, it interests me more that Egypt goes through democracy rather than Tunisia, you know. But still, will we invest on this? Will we try to, see this country in the UN, for example, when they are talking about, Arab issues? So this
sort of as a model or a leader,
yes,
playing a leading role.
A leader role like it, in the 70s, Tunisia was, the Arab League was in Tunis in the 70s before moving to Egypt. And so the other challenge that we as Tunisians is, are we going to just close our eyes about what's happening in the rest of the Arab countries? Because this is also a huge challenge for us. I mean, today when 500 people has been sentenced to death penalty in Egypt, no Tunisian party made a statement. Because we can't afford not having discussions with Egyptians. We can't afford attacking Egyptians. When all Tunisian people are shocked seeing that Saudi women can drive, you can't even imagine it. No one talks about it. Because when Saudi came to us, they're like, can you just give us $1 billion loan? When Qataris are doing whatever they're doing, we are just shutting up. So we are criticizing a lot the US, France, and Europe shutting up when they are in front of these problems. But actually, we as Tunisian also, we know what is it. I remember the day we signed the constitution, I was in the assembly. And the Algerian prime minister was there. And he did this speech. And it was so interesting seeing this Algerian prime minister talking 20 minutes without saying the word freedom or democracy in his speech, while he was there to celebrate the Tunisian constitution. No word about democracy, freedom, or revolution, nothing. And when the Iranian came to, he was talking about the US, and we were, what?
That got covered in the US newspapers.
No, really. And many MPs were in the opposition before, and we know when our president, the Ben Ali, was going everywhere in the world, and everyone was smiling to him like, yeah, Mr. President, and no one talked about this dictator. And we were so angry about it. So we have also a responsibility that we should, take, and we need also to make real statements and have real positions about how democracy is going in the rest of the Arab countries.
So George, how about a kind of a wider angle lens? 5 years from now, we've been talking about democracy and constitutions for hundreds, but if not thousands of years, but now we have a new part of the world where it's being taken very seriously. We have Twitter and Facebook making democracy spread faster. 5 years from now, where do you see the global debate, the global progress on democracy and constitutionalism?
Well, beginning with what Amira was saying, I think that we are seeing nascent democracies being born and developing, and at a tender stage, this is where, she made a good point, certain countries coming in because they're giving loans or they're investing, they will then influence this country and its stance, not in geopolitical terms, but also even on its how outspoken it will be on issues of democracy and human rights and so on. So while Tunisia could be held as a model with all its difficulties of how it's actually been a success story in the Arab world, this is where we should invest. This is where Europe, this is where the United States should invest and promote and say, okay, in this difficult time, we will help you. So if they have high unemployment, we have to deal with that because that could derail the whole project. As a prime minister myself, when we went through, and we have been a democracy now since 1974, but we have lots of problems that hark back to our dictatorial, authoritarian past. One of it is that our public sector is not really working very well. So when I came in and we had this financial problem, I said we need to make reforms. But most of my European counterparts said, no, you just have to cut the deficit. I said, I'll cut the deficit, but if I don't make the reforms, it'll just come back later on. So we have to make reforms in the way we govern our resources, our country, and so on. So this idea is, and you have the IMF coming in, let's say, to Jordan and so on, and other countries, and saying, or even to Egypt. I don't want to get into what Amira said, talked about Egypt, but so looking at the narrow economic situation of, you have a deficit here and so on, why not help these countries in a way economically to be able to then support reforms moving forward? I think this is where we need to look at this. I'll get to another point on nascent democracies, which again Amira alluded to. Democracy is a work in progress. It's not something which we can say we've reached democracy and that's it. We can go back home, we can sit and watch television, and we don't have to care if the leaders up there, we vote for them once every 4 years and that's it. It's a continual struggle. One of the reasons is that, and particularly for countries that are going through transition, is that, as she said, I remember when we were in Greece, internally we didn't have a model of what a democratic politician is. I remember when I was first elected as it would be a congressman here or an MP in Europe or in Tunisia, and we had come out of a dictatorship, and I was first elected a few years later, and it was very against this authoritarian way of politics and so on. So I go to my constituency, and all my friends came around and said, okay, now you've got to buy a black car, a black Mercedes. You have to wear a suit. I'm wearing a suit. You have to pound your hand on the table when you speak, because that is what shows that you're a leader. And if people ask you questions and you shouldn't show that you don't know, you have to show this and so on. So all of a sudden I started getting into this mode. Yes, you're right. I have to do this. I have to do that and so on. And then I sort of stopped myself and I said, wait, if this is what politics is, I'd rather be on a Greek island playing my guitar. And I said, no, I'm going to be different. I'm going to be a democratic politician. And if people like it, fine. If they don't like it, I'll leave politics. But I said, I want to be a different model. So what happens is in society you don't have, if you've been in a dictatorship for years, you don't have many models of what a politician can be like. If a politician says, I don't know this issue, I'd like to ask you your question. In an authoritarian society, that is weakness. You can't be a good leader because you don't know. But a good leader actually has to say when he or she doesn't know. So these are different. There's a whole culture of democracy. So I think we have to see how we nurture this. I want to again go back to ancient Greece, because what happens is when I say democracy is a work in progress, the Greeks, we Greeks have a word in ancient Greece, and today it's called hubris. It's an English word also now, which basically means this abuse of power. And you can, if you are in power, and you've been in power for a long time, or at times you can start abusing power, and power can be more concentrated again. And I think what we will see now in a globalized world is we are seeing even our mature democracies facing problems. So it's not only the authoritarian regimes, it's not only how countries transit from authoritarian regimes to a more democratic regime. We are seeing, for example, a huge concentration of wealth around the world, not only in our societies, but globally. And I'll give you an example. We have, I was trying to fight tax evasion in Greece, which was a big problem. But one of the reasons we had tax evasion was that people could easily move their money out into tax havens, offshore companies, and this was legal, but we were losing revenues. But this concentration of wealth outside our national borders, we couldn't control. So all of a sudden you have a globalized economy with huge amounts of money, and then they come back into your society as lobbies, or even just simply as direct corruption, corrupting our democratic systems. Yeah. So even our mature democracies are facing a question of concentration of wealth and power, which can corrupt our institutions and deprive us of some of our basic democratic rights. The internet, on the one hand, is a great tool for disrupting dictators, but it at some point can become a tool in the hands of dictators. As you said, Twitter could be used then, but even in our societies, we are being watched. I used to ask, I've taught in a number of places here in the US, and even before the NSA issue, I used to tell my students, I would never have had a Facebook in a time putting all my details of my life and so on this Facebook after living through a dictatorship in Greece. Because that I knew could be used against me, and I could be persecuted because they would know, what I read, what my politics were, and so on. So these are new issues that are coming out, and how we democratize globalization. We want local democracy. We want participation. We want democracy at the national level. But there's going to be a question of how you have democracy at a global level. How do you protect certain basic rights? How do we govern this global planet? That's going to be a major challenge. And this is, I think, where the US and the European Union can work together. We're now, for example, in a trade discussion about open trade, but in that discussion we'll be talking about basic things like environment, privacy laws, basic rights. If we put down the rules, we are the two right now still biggest economies. If we put down the rules for the globe, for ourselves, they will be the rules for the globe. It might be a nascent beginning of something like, I wouldn't call it a constitution for the globe, but maybe like a charter or a charter of rights for the globe. You have it in the UN, but if you want to implement it, maybe we working together can help. And this would support the growth of democracies, the strong strength of democracies throughout the world.
Great. Well, thank you all of you for your wonderful questions, and thank you to our panelists.
Okay.
I need to thank, as the head of the Constitution Center, first of all, I have to establish my authority by pounding the podium, but I have to thank my friend David Fontana for masterful moderation of a superb conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Amira used the phrase laboratories of democracy. And of course, that was the phrase of my hero and the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Brandeis would have been proud of this discussion. George, for Brandeis, the model of democracy was ancient Athens, and his favorite book was The Greek Polis. And he would have been excited by the distinctions we've talked about tonight between democracy and constitutionalism, between representative and limited democracy, and between global constitutionalism and localism. I am thrilled about our collaboration. Let Athens and Philadelphia join together and cast light on these great questions. And next time in Athens. Thank you so much.
Very good. Very good. Welcome to Athens and the Mediterranean.